Hi, everyone. This is Leanne, and this is From the Heart. Today, I am interviewing Christopher Balkaran, who is someone that I have been following and just learning from just by following, basically. He is like basically the only person I follow when it comes to politics because I'm really selective and I've actually fact checked him as well, and so I will say that what he says has a lot of credibility, and then when I ask him questions, there's always an answer, and there's always a place where that information came from, and that's more like my style of what I like to follow, and I really appreciate that. And the other thing that I really appreciate about Christopher is that he really tries to do his best to come from a place of non-judgmentalism, and so and we don't really see that a lot. We always like to other the other person just because we're hurt and people don't necessarily take on our opinions. And his podcast is actually about creating a space where every voice can be heard and every perspective is valued. And so I want to interview Christopher on that, and where it's led him, and why he's doing that. And so, Christopher, can you tell us more about yourself and why and how you started your podcast?
Yeah, thanks, Leanne, for having me on. I've always found your DMs to be very respectful and like truly like curious, and I really appreciate that because that's what we need now more than ever, I think. But it really started, I think, about 6 or 7 years ago. I work in the public sector, and the I saw a lot of decisions being made, and I was getting really frustrated with where I was in the organization, the, what was happening, and I felt that I had so much to contribute, and just like it wasn't being really reciprocated.
Yeah.
And I realized that I had to do something about this, that the organization wasn't going to change for Christopher. So I remember going on bike rides and runs outside here in Toronto, and I would always have these ideas about, oh, I just can't believe the media covered that topic in that way. It was so one-sided. They did such an injustice to it. And I thought to myself, one day I came home and I said, well, I'm going to spend like half an hour just writing out what I think could be the antidote to that. What would the ideal, if I had all the time and money in the world, what would I do with my time and money? And I would literally interview as many people as I could who shared different perspectives of what we're hearing, not from a place of judgment, but in a place of true learning and trying to understand a little bit more. And 6 years later, it's been such a journey ever since.
Wow. Yeah, that's awesome. Where has it led you that maybe you wouldn't have expected to get to?
Yeah, so the ethos has always been about having people on to discuss things, big topics, climate change, the Freedom Convoy, basic income. One of my first series that I did was on abortion, and I invited both pro-life and pro-choice groups on. Where it's led me has been, I thought I had an opinion about a lot of these topics: climate change, abortion, basic income, the list, gun control. And after talking to so many experts, not-for-profit organizations, I realize now more than ever there are no quote unquote answers. There's only uh, trade-offs, really, because politicians, governments, they have to make decisions based on the electorate. Those decisions are not final, they're just trade-offs. And after talking to so many experts, I realize there is no quote right decision. It's the best decision with the best information, sure, but that's all very nebulous. So I've learned that I still don't know, and that's okay. And I want to chase that feeling of not knowing because that's what gives me goosebumps when I invite a researcher on who's been, accosted by academia. but their research is so good and so peer reviewed and well tested that it makes you really question what is it that you actually know. So it gets me all excited thinking about more topics that I don't know anything about.
So basically, it's your love for curiosity that kind of keeps you going, and then to detach yourself from opinions that are more limiting. So you kind of opened up your space to, yeah, that's so beautiful. And I think that, yeah, opinions, even though they're important, they can also limit us. I was hanging out with my amazing friends who didn't leave me after my big change that happened after I went to see the convoy. And it's a whole like different kind of, because I'm a person who has left more. I leaned more left throughout my life, and then with the media and things that was happening in life. Anyways, that was something that happened in my life, a big portal, and then I came out of that feeling like, whoa. But my friends, so like I just pointed out a Canadian flag, and I'm like, oh, and like it looks like we're at the convoy basically, and then they're like, no, the convoys are all they're all pro-Trump now. I'm like, oh my gosh, now we're in another box. And so and so I really see the box as so limiting. And I know that people who lean left, which is no longer me, I don't lean either way basically, it brings you down a rabbit hole that brings us to a bunch of lies and also some truths. And then for the other way, I find that it's the same too. And so I really love this idea of curiosity, and also like this idea that everyone can do what's right for them, and knowing that everyone, even if they take the path that is of harm, like let's say according to what I think, that's potentially their path that we have to witness and hopefully just love them, and that's, you know, that those choices that they make, and hopefully with the discussions that we're having, because if I'm saying you are doing this wrong, that person is going to like never listen to me. But if I say, you know, I come from I come from a place of not judgmental ideas, then they're more likely to listen to what I have to say about the harms that aren't discussed with them. So for me, that's more in the medical field, especially obstetrics, you know. So when I tell people, because people don't necessarily want to hear what I have to say, because then they don't know what choice to make, because their care provider and the guidelines are saying one thing and I'm saying this is based on something else, you know. So but the more open-minded we are, and if I understand the fear of being of making choices that go against medical recommendation, then I can come off a lot like softly, and people can come to me when they're ready, you know. So I feel that that's kind of my thought around being curious and not judgmental. Do you have any specific examples of where you might have deviated, like your thought or your opinion? Yeah.
Of course, yeah, so many. It seems like every topic I cover, there's so many layers to it. You mentioned the Freedom Convoy. That's a great example. I interviewed Jenna Quenville, who everyone should listen to that podcast, because Jenna was from a small town, did not like the mandates, did not like what was happening. Worked in the health sector, went out to a protest, was filmed and photographed at the protest. Those photographs were then uploaded to a Facebook group for the small community she lived in, and she was later fired from her job. And that story, was not captured in any mainstream media at all. And I understand it's small town, it's one person, I get that. But there was a clear example where if you just watched the news, you would think that the Freedom Convoy was this monolithic entity. They were all in these trucks, and they were trying to wreak havoc on Ottawa, and they all hated Justin Trudeau. But in between that, you had stories like Jenna's, who was just a hardworking Canadian, had a young daughter at home, single mom, went to a protest, didn't think anything of it, and next thing you know, she was fired from her job. And that's the Canada I never want to see again. I never want to see that happen. We have the right, all Canadians. I don't care if you agree or disagree with anything that I put out there. You have the right. You have the right to do that. And I would never, if a board of directors was like, Christopher, you have to fire Leanne. She was filmed at a protest. I'd be like, then fire me first, because I don't want to be part of a decision where I am telling someone they can't exercise their rights as a Canadian. And I had this professor tell me something, and it stuck with me to this day. And he said, if our rights can't be protected and deployed when the situation warrants it the most, say in the Freedom Convoy, then what are our rights good for? And I've just really internalized that. It's like, going to a protest downtown Toronto right now, no one would think anything of it. But if I were to tell you, if you go to that protest and someone films you and posts it to social media, you may get fired. I think there would be like a lot of outcry against that. And so I want people out there to know that the coverage of things is nowhere near what it may seem. And there's hardworking people out there, not like podcasters aside, but there's hardworking people who are putting their careers and lives on the line to bring you those stories. And I've never learned more than, learning from the people who are on the front lines. And talking to Jenna, she was very, very obviously emotional. I think part of it too, just jogging my memory, I think she was also disqualified from employment insurance because it was a protest that involved the Freedom Convoy. There was some technicality there. But that was such a turning point, I think, for myself and so many who listened, to say, this is not the Canada we want at all. And I do think, maybe this is just me like ego boosting, but I do think the government heard what people were saying. I do think that. I think that there was so much outrage at what the government was doing that they themselves internally were probably like, this is getting out of hand. So all that to say, that was a real turning point for me.
Yeah, that's when everything in my career changed, and my way of seeing things all changed in just an hour. So
that's so wild.
Yes. And then I quit my job a few months later. So
wow.
Yeah. So you also mentioned abortion, and that's like something and so in my personal line of thought is just that I believe that safe abortions should be available, but like I've also never spent time to listen to the other side of it, other than some more religious kind of things. And I'm just wondering, has like your discussions that you've had, have they opened you up to like other things that we're not seeing in the mainstream kind of discussions?
100%. Definitely. Abortion is a tough topic in Canada because, we're the only G7 country with no abortion laws at all. And, that does open us up to criticisms from other countries. So there's so many things that I've learned. First, Canada has approximately hovering between 85 to 100,000 abortions annually. And what's interesting is my assumption was similar to the United States. I thought 13 to 17-year-olds is probably where we see a spike because teenage pregnancies are probably on the rise, especially in low to middle income communities. And that's not the case at all. In fact, I believe only 2% are in that age group. The majority are 25 to 29-year-olds, which is very interesting. What I learned from the pro-life movement was, and this is where it was so fascinating because both sides agreed. The pro-life movement said they wanted more education and awareness to teenagers about safe sex, about what to do if there is a unplanned pregnancy, and to showcase the supports, especially for young girls, because what a lot of maternity clinics found is that a lot of young girls come to the abortion clinic first without talking to parents, a guardian, a social support worker, a nurse. They go right to the abortion clinic. And so many times the abortion clinic has to be psychologist, psychotherapist, abortion doctor, counselor, post, all the things to this one person. And the lack of awareness of the multiple amounts of support that exist is a real issue. Interestingly enough, the pro-choice groups also agreed with that and said, yes, like we want people to make the most informed decision possible. And so I asked both groups if they'd come on and actually agree. And they said, well, some said yes, others said no. And I thought, oh, that's the magic moment where we can really push the yardstick further. Because interestingly enough, I didn't know this, but a lot of doctors do not receive training on how to navigate those initial conversations with a young girl, as an example. And so that was one area where my mind was blown after that. I thought, oh, if I were prime minister, I would try to or premier, I would try to navigate this, because I do think that's where perhaps both sides can find some commonality.
Oh, wow. It's true. So I did some work with the high risk women. So these were women that were homeless, drug using during the pregnancy, sometimes found out much, much later in pregnancy. And so that's when I had to use and ask, how they felt about continuing on their pregnancies and that kind of thing. And it's true that that's when how to deal with someone who potentially would want an abortion for things that aren't like genetic things. That's when I had to learn them kind of on the spot at the very end of my career. And so it's true. That's that's all those commonalities. That's when we can, like you said, push the yardstick but like that's where we can bring that change. But only if we're curious enough to get to that place, So
and I think the other thing too, and I think both the pro-life and pro-choice groups, wherever you stand on this issue, I always tell people, wherever you stand, it doesn't mean most Canadians agree with you. In fact, what we do see is when Canadians are asked about this issue, we do find a lot of divergence, and I do think it's because of the lack of awareness, lack of perhaps people willing to talk about their experiences, such as what you've experienced as well. I think, in a way, as wild as it sounds, I think the United States has normalized a lot of really tough politically charged conversation in their dialect, in their discourse. And in Canada, I find we really do struggle with that. We're kind of like walking on eggshells with a lot of things. Whereas in the United States, I feel like it's a bull in the china shop. It's just like people are just going for it. And I do think there's some merit to that, because we do need to kind of, bring out a little bit more so that we can have informed discussion, not inflammatory discussions. And I think that's important.
That's something I think our culture needs to learn, and it's going to happen. And even like, I know that a lot of people have lost friends with changes that happened with the convoy and but I didn't lose a friend. Actually, I lost one friend, and then that person came back into my life. And so I think that we're just slowly learning how to have these conversations and be a little bit more open-minded, and eventually we there's something that will trigger us and that will bring us to the right place, and with an open heart, basically, right?
Yes. Very important.
So you did like a whole series on MAiD, on like assisted suicide, and I don't know anything about it. I haven't I didn't dive in that topic, and it's also very not related to midwifery, but just because I like to talk a lot about medical things, I'm just wondering if you could give us a synopsis of like what's going on there. I'm learning that we're now opening the door to children that have mental health disorders. I have not like fact checked that myself, and we've also opened it up to people who are feeling just suicidal rather than like a different kind of illness that where it's at the end of their stint of life. And so I'm just wondering what you found out, what you fact checked.
Yeah, great question, Leanne. So, Canada, comparatively speaking, to our European friends, is a bit, quote, late in the game when it came to euthanasia, assisted suicide. We in Canada have coined the term medical assistance in dying. That's a Canadian-made term. It's not internationally known. Usually it's euthanasia or assisted suicide. Canada is very unique in how we've applied MAiD. There's two tracks in Canada. The first track is where death is certain. So you have terminal disease like stage 4 cancer. And there is a prognosis that you will not survive, you will pass. And so it's how you want to live out those last few months, etc. But then there's track 2, and track 2 is where death is not foreseeable. And so this is intolerable suffering, and this is brand new. It's relatively brand new. 2021 it was introduced, and basically it says that if you have intolerable suffering, it's a combination of both physical and mental anguish. So, for example, if you're living with a chronic disease and the chronic disease is causing you mental health issues, depression, anxiety, etc., your days are very hard to get through. You can qualify under track 2. What's very interesting about Canada, the majority of MAiD cases are track 1, where death is foreseeable. But what differentiates Canada from the rest of the world is that on a year-over-year basis, MAiD is growing by approximately 16%, and so we started in 2016 when it was legal, and there was about 1,000 people who selected MAiD. We're up to, I want to say 20,000 on an annual basis, hovering around there. So we've been growing at a very exponential rate, mostly track 1. Track 2 is also coming up, but it's very marginal. Excuse me. And what we're seeing, the data is really interesting when you're a nerd like me and you go through all these federal government reports. They do track a lot of data when it comes to MAiD, not as much as I think they could, but the data is really interesting. We're seeing higher number of white community members than non-white, like disproportionately higher. So that's one. What we're seeing with track 2 is that a lot of the, quote, intolerable suffering, a lot of researchers and psychotherapists say that these can be fixed. So some of them include loneliness, or housing as an issue, or unemployment as an issue, and there are tons of social supports. And this is where it gets a bit murky. So say you have a chronic illness, and then you can't find housing, and let's say family has disowned you, and you're living alone and you face loneliness. You may be less willing to enter a social gathering or a social group or a focus group or a therapy session because you're in the grips of a mental health episode, as an example. And so some may argue that you may not be in the right frame of mind to select MAiD because there is an imbalance that can be fixed with sustained exposure, say, to therapy sessions, group therapy sessions, etc. But your willingness to, let's say, not take those and still select MAiD technically is your right. And, who is the government to tell you, that you can't select MAiD because you're refusing certain treatments? I mean, it gets very murky, but all that to say, The numbers in Canada should be alarming because we haven't really grasped whether or not MAiD is being offered by medical practitioners or if it's the patient choosing MAiD.
Oh.
And I think that's the sticking point that a lot of committees and focus groups are having. They don't know. We need more data to tease that out, to explain the numbers.
Mm. What do you know about children?
Yes. So Dying with Dignity Canada is a group that I interviewed. It's not for profit. And they have they are a big advocate for, euthanasia, assisted suicide, and a much more liberalizing of MAiD. I would argue that our policies are pretty liberal as it is, but one of their points that they really want, that they are advocating for, is lowering the age for MAiD. Now, 18, of course, is the age. They want to lower that to 12 years old. Now, some would argue that an adolescent going through a depressive episode with a chronic illness is as intolerable suffering as someone in their 20s or 30s or 50s or 60s or 70s. Who are we to make that judgment? But my counter to that would be, it would have to be, obviously with the parents' consent and all that. And I'm sure that's part of their proposal. But I don't believe, and maybe this is my bias, right? I don't believe a 12 to 17-year-old is of sound mind to make a decision. But then again, who am I to say that, right? So like, as I say these things, I always catch myself because I am so curious that I'm like, wait a second. If I'm saying this about a 12-year-old, why does that not apply to a 60-year-old who is selecting MAiD because they're facing intolerable suffering? Why do they get the right and the 12-year-old doesn't? And if the argument is, well, the 12-year-old hasn't lived enough to know, like, okay, I get that. But again, that's a judgment call. And there should be barriers for sure, but we should actually test the rigor of our barriers against that same like logic. So if we go down the path of intolerable suffering, we have to make an age requirement. But if we put an age requirement, we have to be very clear on why. And I don't think we're that clear on it.
Yeah. That's really fascinating. I have a lot of weird questions in my head. So first of all, the brain of a person is not developed until the age of 21 for females, and then 25 for males. And then the other thing is, in the opposite world, where a child is diagnosed with something where they just have a tiny chance of life if they do chemo or are like, big like intervention things, but they barely have a chance, basically, if the parent decides that they're not going to go with that teeny tiny chance and go through like the entire thing to try to keep their child alive. Their child will be taken from them. That's what I understand. Like, that's not something that I have been. I don't. I only deal with people who are pregnant and just had babies, but I have family members who work with children in hospital settings and things like that, and then that's what I heard. And so that's like we have like two different opposites. We're going to take a child away, and then the other one is we're going to do that. And I think that they're two extremes, and we need to we need to come up with something. But so yeah, there's just like, to me, it's just baffling that we're at these two extremes and there's no in between here.
Yeah, even the College of Physicians in Quebec, there was a member of the committee who said, if your infant is born with a deformality, a medical condition, the parents have the right to end the infant's suffering. And so that opens up a whole ethical question right there, because the criminal code does exist for infanticide and things like, infanticide does happen. Because many times accidental pregnancies, parents are not okay with babies, how the baby looks. It's very scary how infanticide happens. It does happen. And if we apply euthanasia to infants, what happens to our criminal code as well?
Mm. Yeah, those are big questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, who knows what the solution is? But talking about them with different experts, it really is the solution.
Yeah, I did a panel with 3 psychologists, and interestingly enough, there was a study done, I believe, on 16 quadriplegics, and 16, it was a group of quadriplegics, and they interviewed them right after their accident. And most of their accidents were very horrific. Like, it's amazing that they survived. And yet all of them, like very close after, once they knew they would be a quadriplegic for the rest of their life, they were 100% suicidal. They were like, this is not the life I want to live. I'm okay. It's over. And with sustained focus group, talk therapy, and other therapy interventions, within 90 days, that number dropped 60%. And within 120 days, that number dropped to like 10%. And so a lot of psychologists do say that we do see sustained changed behavior. And by the end of their treatment, they found that when they interviewed the patients, they would say things like, this is my life now. I'm fully adapted to it. I'm loved. I'm cared for. People come and visit me. I always get a wheelchair parking spot. I mean, people really do look at the positives, but sometimes it does take that intervention for people to see the positive. So we also can't deny the real impact that many psychological interventions do have on people too.
That's a really, really inspiring study. And wouldn't it be nice if we talked about that study more? Like, because it also puts a thing on like me who like might be down because of something. And then there's something, there's just like someone who came out of their depression, right? They were suicidal at one point and then they came out of it.
Yeah.
I think things like that are important to talk about. The other thing with children is that, so as adults, our brains can kind of understand that even if we're depressed, that it's a state that can change, but children can't, they're not there yet until their brains, I'm not sure until what point, but later until their brains are developed. Feeling stuck in your depression or sadness or whatever, you think it's going to last forever when you're a child. And so it could, like, depending where this goes with the children, we just would have to make sure that that's something that we assess properly.
Yeah, and I think, and I would push the Canadian government and so many governments that are wrestling with these topics, when you do have, because the governments do have like Senate committee hearings where they invite experts on, I would really encourage the government not only invite experts of all different perspectives, but be as open and as responsive to what they're saying. I've had academics on who testified before Senate committee hearings and felt like they were kind of laughed out the room, despite putting 20 plus years of their career into their work. And I understand, politicians are politicians and they've all got their own agendas, but that's where policy really matters. And if you invite someone on who challenges your views, that should make goosebumps on your skin stand up, because you're in a position to influence policy. And inviting as many different, researchers, organizations on, I think is beneficial. You don't want to come across as one-sided or in the pockets and back pockets of some of these well-funded organizations. There's too many diverse perspectives out there. We have to give them a voice as well.
Yeah, it makes it like, do you have any of those people on your podcast?
I do, yeah. There's always a great conversation when I have them on.
Yeah, I want to dive into that. I want to, what they were saying. Yeah,
for sure.
And then the other thing, so I had an older episode on gender dysphoria and how we manage it in children. And
Yeah.
then you pointed out on your Instagram, I couldn't find it anymore, but I saw you say that, so there was a law that was being passed, and it was about not telling the parents what was happening in schools, and when the children were showing signs of having gender dysphoria, like changing their pronouns and their names. And then there's even an article that says, "Who's Carl?" when parents are the last to know, or something like that. And so, but you said that there was that, like, that's changed. Did that law not pass?
No, you're completely right, Leanne. What happened was during the pandemic, man, it seems like forever ago. But during the pandemic, there were students in New Brunswick who, I think the school policy pushed something where you could go to school with your preferred pronouns and preferred name, and school administrators must call you by those preferred pronouns and name and withhold that information from the parent, should the child choose that's what they want. So they could be Christopher at home, Christina at school. There was countless protests, and I think even moderates at the time said, yeah, this is pretty far, because you're not telling the parent. And I wrestle with this, because some would say that the child feels unsafe at home and so feels safe in a school setting. Now, far be it for me to like generalize on all children, but that's a big stretch and assumption to make, to then put into your policy, right? To assume that the child is unsafe at home, so I'm only going to refer to Christopher as Christina, she, her. That's a pretty big assumption to make, that the child feels unsafe. Perhaps the child is wrestling with, we talked about having their brains not fully formed, having that conversation with their parents about, I may not be attracted to the opposite sex, or I'm exploring my gender. That's a tough conversation. So it's not that there's an unsafe environment. It's just perhaps the better strategy would be, here's some tools to navigate that conversation. But you're totally right. So there's a lot of protests against that policy, and the Higgins government in New Brunswick, they actually reversed that decision. They said, no, you can't do that. But then as of this year, New Brunswick did elect a Liberal government. Susan Holt is the premier, and the Holt government reversed the consent for those under 16. So you can use your preferred name, preferred pronouns at school, but any official document, say like Christopher's going on a field trip, it has to use their legal name, or if they're using a preferred name, it has to be with parental consent. So there's some power back given to the parents. But I do think this is a policy that, again, this is just my perspective, we went pretty far in the policy without consulting parents. And I think that was done intentionally, because if they were to consult parents, no parent would agree to that, right? So we have to be, as a society, very concerned when decisions involving children, which you study and work with, we have to be very concerned, because as adults, we have the ability to make decisions on behalf of children that may not necessarily be in their family's best interest, and that gets very murky, I think, as a society.
Wow. So this law, was it passing in Ontario? Or like
No,
it did.
it was just New Brunswick. I think there were a few other provinces as well, but it sparked a whole national debate. But at the time, we were so focused on COVID and getting out of it that I do think this kind of got lost in the shuffle a bit. So my hope is that I can bring that back and talk to more people and get that back on our radar again.
That's so interesting. Like, it's actually in my head that I want to create a course for parents on how to discuss sex with their children. My mom was a sex ed teacher, and reproductive life is my entire life. And
right.
But like it's like a whole new ball game than what it was for you and I when we were children.
Yeah.
Because now, like, with screens, all kinds of things are available to children that are really negative, and we have to
Mhm.
talk about them before we are ready as parents, compared to before, when it was my mom who was talking to me about sex. She could talk to me about, like, the how she wanted to make that discussion, right? Two people are in love, and they're, like, that way
Yeah.
doing things. And so now we have to talk about what we see on screens. And now we also have to talk about gender, which is really different. Like, it's good that it's added in there, because there are people who really are have gender dysphoria, even in their, it continues on into their adulthood, but those are very few
Yeah.
compared to in childhood. You just have to go through puberty, and then it actually changes, and you're a little bit more likely to be a lesbian or to be gay, if you've had a stint of gender dysphoria in your childhood, but not necessarily. So those are things, like, people are not discussing the data, the research, and which I don't know what triggered me or what changed me, because I used to be all like, yeah, that's great that there's more openness to this kind of thing, but then and that children can actually start changing their bodies. That was me at some point. And now, because now I've actually reviewed the data and had like a more of a curiosity kind of mindset, now I understand that it can be really detrimental to children for the rest of their lives, and that most don't, like, they desist. Most children desist being having gender dysphoria. So those are,
I had Ken Zucker on, and we talked about gender dysphoria. And Ken Zucker is he used to lead up the gender dysphoria clinic at the Center for Addictions and Mental Health here in Toronto, and he put out research. I mean, he ran that clinic, I think, for well over a decade, probably 2 decades. But he put out research saying, we also have to unpack gender dysphoria from autism spectrum disorder, because sometimes we conflate the behaviors of children when they're just exhibiting, obsessive compulsive disorder. It could be that a 2-year-old is just very interested in dressing like the opposite sex just as a phase, but will grow out of it. But in that phase, it could meet some of the requirements of GD, but GD, which he said, it has to be sustained. It has to be over a longer period of time for us to be more certain that there is gender dysphoria at play and not autism spectrum disorder. Well, apparently that caused people to say, like, how dare you say that this is autism? I have GD, or GD is not a medical condition. Like, it's part of who I am. And that's where the curiosity butts up against our bias. Like, we should be very curious about these topics, and we should be more willing to dive into them than run away because it may be perceived as biased to some people or offensive to some people.
There's also, like, the case of trauma that isn't assessed medically. It's not just the autism spectrum disorder. Like, all these things that we're not doing right now, and we are the way that we are managing whatever we label as gender dysphoria, we are managing with a lifetime of medication and surgeries.
Exactly.
And really painful in a few years. So, I went into my other episode, but, like, it's just really mind blowing when you look at it the other way. And then if you really look at it from my stance, I'm actually standing up for the safety of these children and people with gender dysphoria, and the different ways that they want to. Like, let's say you are an adult with gender dysphoria, you should know about, like, the things that you can do, and then the long-term risks of them, so that you can decide, how do you want to change your body. Maybe you don't remove your healthy breasts. Maybe you don't, right? Maybe you just want to put a big t-shirt on and cut your hair shorter, and so it's I just wish that there was information available to them rather than a push for change. So
I love that. Leanne, because you're totally right. I wish I found my spiritual path earlier in life, because it's so hard, right? Because you want to teach this to people, but people have their own paths to go down. But I would. It's easy for me to say I'm a heterosexual man. I'm 100% my gender is part of like my identity, and I'm very comfortable in that identity. So far be it for me to tell somebody who's not, who has GD. But I would also say that it being heterosexual doesn't define me. I don't walk around all day wearing my sexuality, if that makes sense, because I understand that's just part of the story, and it's not really who I am. It's just a spiritual being having a human existence. And so there is that real sometimes obsession with the physical body, and I do think there's merit in slowly detaching yourself from your physical body to say you are much more than your sexual orientation, your gender identity, your there's so much more there. And if you get wrapped up in that a bit too much, it actually may lead to more suffering. And that includes heterosexual men and women as well, because we live in a hypersexualized environment too that I think should also be discussed at some point as well.
Yeah. Do you want to like say what you were thinking about that? Because
yeah, I think it's interesting you mentioned just like talking to people about how to be intimate and how to be and sex. I think that's so important. What we're seeing in the studies is that, especially with Gen Z, there's less sex happening, apparently, based on some studies. I mean, I don't know who's doing the studies, but there's a real issue with especially young men not having sex at young ages. For us growing up, it was a very different reality and environment than the generation below us that are growing up and courting and dating and all that. But when it comes to sexual identity and sexual expression, I do find that we in the West, we're bombarded with sexual imagery, and I just imagine what that must do to a young adolescent mind of either gender, that must create stereotypes, views. What's the ideal body? What should I expect of my partner when engaging in sex? What do I expect of myself? After doing the abortion series, there's a lot of shame that women have with the decisions that they've made, the men that they've slept with, leading to depression and suicide. I do think that has a lot to do with the pressure we as a collective place on women, could be, but also for men, you're not a man until you have sex kind of thing, especially as a younger adolescent, perhaps less so now, but definitely when we were growing up, that was definitely the thing. And I do think our society is very unique in the hypersexualized sense. In Eastern cultures, I think they understood sex as a life force energy that can be regulated and can be controlled, and is pleasurable. But if left unchecked, it can lead you down paths of like adultery, of sin, of cheating, of cheating, adultery, but also like obsession of feeling completely outside of yourself. And I do think that's maybe something we in the West should wrestle with a little bit more.
Yeah, I've been talking to a lot of my friends about high risk sex, and I just feel like we need to have a place where there's no judgment about that, and then also educate. Like there are, some of, whether they're my acquaintances or friends or whatever, but I'm talking to, sometimes I just, I talk to them about herpes, and then they're like, oh, and then they're the ones who were engaging in things where they really weren't understanding it. So you don't always get herpes from someone who has it and things like that. But like it's, I just wish that and then people say it's feminism. I'm not sure who's right. Like how high risk sex is not feminism. Like
Mhm.
informed, like talking, being honest with your partner, what you're gonna get, being clear on what you want, and then
Yeah.
making sure, like, I think that's more feminism. And in a way, it's just self-respect. For me, the definition of my own definition of feminism is just that I am moving out of the state of victimhood. And for me, racism, like anti-racism, is the same for me. That's just what it is. And so how can I keep myself safe is one of those things. And so I wish that there was more discussion. Maybe I should do a podcast with someone who really doesn't feel like they know a lot, and then that will prompt me to actually answer at a level that maybe people need.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think that's bang on. And then, from the male side, it's tough for men, as I'm sure you know very well. Like a driving force is sex, and it's like some say it's primal. It's like in our DNA. But there is a psychology as well for men to understand in courting and how to treat a woman, etc. Often I find that we don't do that perspective justice because it's dismissed sometimes as like aggressive and like animalistic. But I think that's where men start tuning out when they should be tuning in of healthy relationships, because the sexual urges for men are very strong. I'm sure there's stats on sexual assaults, and like it's just dramatically, an overwhelming urge that overcame this person. You hear these stories of guys like in the bushes in a park just grabbing a random woman. I mean, that is an animalistic urge. And I would sometimes argue, I wonder if they're under the influence, maybe sometimes, but maybe not other times. And yet that's something we as a society should wrestle with, because how do you address that as well?
Yeah. I've heard that those kinds of situations were more aggression than
Mm,
sexual, but like that's not
mhm.
something that I can actually um
Yeah,
say and be confident in.
for sure.
But men do need a way of knowing how to be um safe, because there's also people who think that it's not safe to even approach a woman.
Yes.
But that, like,
Yes.
courting and those are they're completely different.
Yes.
And women do want to be approached by
Yes.
men. Like, we don't we expect it from men, right?
Yes.
So how do we do that safely? Like, one of the things like men need to hear from women is that do it without expectation. Don't do it for sex. Do it because relating to a person is where we're going to learn the most. So I always say to my partner, like the purpose of having a relationship is for growth. When growth ends, that's when the relationship ends. But that doesn't mean that that ever has to end either. But sometimes it's just being more patient. But so in any sort of relationship, even with your sister or your neighbor, the growth is the purpose, basically. And so how can you grow to like have these discussions with a person that feels different and maybe you're attracted to? And in courting, like, you need to drop, like, of course she's gonna say yes and want my number. You have to drop that. You're gonna approach her as she's a human, and I am just interested in seeing if we vibe and if we converse well. And then you might ask the question, because maybe she does have a boyfriend and you forgot to ask that, right? And maybe she would say yes if she didn't, but right now she can't. And so it's just like, can you approach a woman and just have no like expectation from her? So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's bang on, Leanne. The challenge I think for men is, as you know very well, like our egos are really high, and rejection is like stabbing someone like multiple times, because it is so like you just feel so weak. And I think that comes back to that like protector gene. And so perhaps the first step is coaching men on, hey, rejection's going to happen. It's not about you. It's not about you. It's about where that person is in their life, like you said, relationships, etc. maybe they just want to go home and they don't want to be bothered. They had a long day at work, or it has nothing to do with you. And maybe that person goes home and says, "Oh, maybe I should have said yes to like a drink with that person." So it's not about you. It's about everything else but you. Unless, of course, you're very aggressive and you're coming across aggressive, then it definitely is about you. But because I know there's a lot of good guys that do approach women and are rejected just a handful of times, that's enough to take that really good guy out of the dating pool. And I think online dating has also done a number on male egos and all that. So perhaps starting there with men to say, hey, it's okay, it's nothing personal, but don't think this is a reflection of your worth, your self-worth. Because when we look at depression, anxiety, suicide, a lot of these things result in how, they went for a job and they went for a promotion and they were rejected, or their wife left them. It's rejection based. And I do think men struggle with rejection a lot. And that should be something that we should be unpacked more. That it's okay. It's fine. It's not about you,
It's kind of like, to me, so if women get rejected too in all kinds of ways too, and maybe we deal with it differently. Maybe that's a really good discussion with like someone who knows more about the gender, like the sex differences. But like, so what I would do if I felt rejected is like, okay, how can I love that part of myself and be like, so that's just my own practice. You can meditate on it, like, and then be the container, like, observe the feeling instead of being the feeling. And then what does that part of you need to hear? And so anyways, that's just how I would cope with it, and it's so that it can evolve. And then when I don't get the job that I want, when I don't get the date that I want, those kinds of things, it's less and less personal. And then I actually see rejection as like, it saved me from that. It's just like, you take it less personal at that point, so how can we get ourselves there? And that, I think that's an individual kind of thing. Sometimes like therapy, depending what has happened in their childhood and things like that, can be really helpful. We don't need to be so stuck on just one, just one outcome. And
you're so right. I think every no is an answer to a yes, and it's a really tough pill to swallow for guys, and I think that's part of the challenge. I remember reading this somewhere, but I actually stood outside a therapy clinic in Toronto with the mic, and I was doing street interviews. And I just went up to people and said, if therapy were 100% covered by the government, it was free, you didn't have to pay $1, would you go? And I'll tell you honestly, not a single man said I'd go. Like a lot of girls said 100%, like it cost me an arm and a leg as it is. Like I needed to be free. And all the guys were like, no way, I'm not doing that. And so I think sometimes we're approaching things where there is a misunderstanding of the male psychology in all of this. Because what you've said makes so much sense, but yet it's not somehow resonating. And maybe our approach just needs to change. And I don't know what that is. But I just see it amongst, my close group of friends, sometimes even with myself. Like if I go for a bigger job and I get rejected, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a reflection of me. Whereas others are like, good for you for even applying. I wouldn't have applied to that, so we're very hard on ourselves, and I think that's part of it as well.
All of us are our biggest critics. Like I'm my critic and you are your biggest.
Yes.
And so I like, the other thing is, on my list of what I wanted in a man, what like that I was gonna date, was I want a man who takes care of himself. And my partner is someone who has sought out some help, and like through like therapy and things like that. And like for me, the fact that I'm entering a relationship where he's done that, I know that we're not stuck. Before we're in the relationship. And so, and maybe like what men need to hear is the men who have chosen to do their therapies, maybe we need to interview men, like you and I can interview men who have done that, and so
Yeah.
to kind of expand the mind of like, what is it going to look like when I go, and what like how someone's life has changed because of therapy and because of coping mechanisms, and that they've adopted from therapy, and perception changes that I don't know, maybe like that's just my perspective.
Yeah, no, you're right.
What would help me like decide to go, should I go through EMD, like different things in therapy, and would that resonate for you as a man? Do you think that could be helpful?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think definitely it could. It's tough because every man and woman is very different as well. Despite the commonalities we all share, we are very different, and I think some men do struggle with anger, and they're angry not just at their partner, but they're angry at a lot of things that are happening in society, and it's the internalization of that anger. And so when someone reaches out to say, "Hey, have you thought of like," the automatic is like no and like walls up and shut down. And so I don't know, I think there's ways within the things that men like to do, like sports and drinking, like there's ways where that can maybe be an outlet and a way to reach men to talk about what they're going through. And maybe there's innovative ways to incorporate that at sports venues, at bars. I remember during the HIV epidemic, they would free condoms at every gay bar, and people thought it was like this bad government policy because it was shaming the gay community, but it was a way of, hey, addressing a real concern in the community. And so I do think that there are maybe community-based outreach mechanisms that can happen. When I think of men in policing and firefighters, what they see every day and how they internalize that, I hope there are supports there for them, especially after a very traumatic call. I really hope that after a very traumatic call, like the Toronto Police Service says, Christopher, we're intervening at this moment right now because we know what you saw was extremely traumatic. I don't know if there is.
I don't think so.
Right. And so
yeah.
That can be a major impact if there was. But you're right. I think there's different approaches for sure.
Yeah. There's there was a birth that I went to where there's a lot of fear that had to run through my mind, but I had to keep moving kind of thing. And the birth photographer that was there talked to me and the other midwife and was like, do you guys go through therapy? And like it was like an automatic no from us, like we're above that kind of. and it's I know that in the medical world, I don't know about paramedics and firefighters, and I would assume that from like the law enforcement, it might be a little bit like the medical world, and I think we need to talk about like the things that are hard on us. Where we come into these jobs wanting to help people, and then we're with them at some times that are really intense, and sometimes we know these people well, and we do need to unpack and kind of decompress ourselves, and it's not normalized at all. But yeah, that like the men in like it's often men in law enforcement, right? So how do we include it in the work culture that a boss would say, let's have a talk, how are you feeling, how are you coping, and then say like maybe therapy, because people who are employed have a few more options when it comes to benefits and things like that. So like maybe the boss should know what's available to those people.
Yeah, no, you're totally right.
But we are making lots of headways in the world of mental health, like just by bringing up awareness. And so, but now it's like, how do we what are the tools for that? And then maybe making another box, like a different toolbox for men that have a little less stigma or are more helpful for men.
Yeah, I think so. And it can be as simple as, going back to ancient teachings of, positive thinking, positive thought. And one thing I usually do is when like negative thoughts do creep in, I immediately just write them down or just say, hang on, something's happening here. Like the elevator was broken and someone like, who do I call? This is BS. I'm like, pause. Like things break. That's okay. Right? Like, why am I getting so worked up about it? And so it's just those simple things do matter, because I do think if you think negative, there are negative things that do happen. I can't explain it, but when you think in a very different way, when you start being more solutions focused, it's easy to say. But if you treat every day as a practice, to say, okay, well, today I just reshifted that one negative thought and I saw all these positive things happen. I wonder if I do that, just catch myself multiple times in the day, see what happens. That can make a big difference in people's lives. And I know it sounds hokey, but if you think truly, if you do think positively, you do get positive outcomes. I've seen it's happen in my own life, and I think more men and women could benefit from that.
I've just started doing that. Like
Oh, nice.
mental
Yeah.
that something can take, and I'm like, okay, that's not how I want to feel, and this is
Yes.
the story that's going on in my head based on this thing, which is it's real, but
Yeah.
also where is it not real, and then where do I have control in the situation, which actually moves us from like victim mentality to outside of it. And like our society is suffering a lot and learning a lot from being stuck in that victim mentality. And I see, yeah, I just but I think for me, I try to be the best. Like I try to, instead of preaching, I want to really integrate that for myself, and that's been a process and probably will be for the rest of my life, to like not get stuck in, because what you were saying about anger, and like I feel like I'm that person, even though you define it more as the anger, and I did deny it, like I didn't want to do therapy for a long time, and all like things like that, and so, but it's what are the tools that work for me, basically, and
Yeah.
mhm,
That's awesome, Leanne.
yeah. So okay, so out of all the things you've looked at, you've like gone through so many political things. What is something that you think we need to have? We need to start looking at a little bit more, be more informed about as a whole.
Yeah, that's a great question, Leanne. I would say, regardless where you are, a conservative or liberal, and I'm going to use those two buckets. Of course, people are PPC, NDP, Green, but wherever you stand, just know the party that you vote for is a party that wants your vote. They're selling you something, and your vote is how they're going to capture what they want from you. Once they get into power, it's very different, and they're going to make decisions that do not align with your morals, your ethics, that are very politicized and political, and go against the ethos of what makes you liberal, what makes you conservative. That needs to be discussed. Both parties have done things that would just very nonsensical, illogical. We're seeing that in the United States right now with Trump and Epstein and all that. But I want every Canadian to know that just because you're liberal does not mean a liberal government is for the environment, is for public health care, is for more funding in your community, is for funding for the most vulnerable. That's not always the case. And we need to be more open-minded about who and what we're voting for. That I think we need to discuss, because one thing I've noticed online is when people say, oh, I voted for Mark Carney or I voted for Pierre Poilievre, they have a very narrow view of what they expect of their leader. And I'll tell you, in the past few months of Mark Carney being in office, I would argue he's done more conservative type policies, perhaps because of the Trump tariffs, than liberal. And that poses challenges for moderate conservatives. So all that to say, I do think we should be holding our politicians to a higher standard of what it means to be liberal, what it means to be conservative, because they love the fact that there's this nebulous space that you can say that I'm a liberal, I get your vote, and I don't have to act liberal when I'm in power. They love that because that's a politician loves that. We need to be talking about that more. And I think we need to have open and honest dialogue about our politics because that'll inform the policies that we choose as a country. And it's not right, it's not left. It's we as Canadians need to hold our politicians to a much higher standard. There's too much on the line, I think, going forward, and it's something that I need to unpack even more. But one thing I found in my recent social media posts.
Yeah. Do you think if we try to hold them up to a higher standard, like how do you think we should do that? Because a lot of us feel like disempowered in the world of politics.
Yeah, that's a great question, Leanne. I've never seen civil society have more power than now because politicians, and I hate to make this generalization, but I don't know if they know what sometimes they think on policy, because social media is such a powerful indicator of where things fit in an agenda. And I think our voices matter more now. I mean, just the other day I posted something you saw about temporary foreign workers, 130,000 views, 130,000 on TikTok. I mean, people are commenting. This is nowhere on a politician's radar. I think it's those voices matter. The comment sections do matter, and that's how we inform our politicians. It's through social media. It's through organized discussion. And I think the clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Sabia, recently said, the public service is now the place where rigorous debate and diverse perspectives need to be housed. And the clerk of the Privy Council saying that means all of us should be engaging in accepting diverse perspectives, different ideas, putting forward new and innovative ideas, because the politicians don't know. They have no idea where to stand on things. Mark Carney said that he's going to cut the number of temporary foreign workers. That would only happen because people are talking about it. That's not a liberal thing. Liberals would say, let's keep increasing immigration. But because so many of us are talking about the real concerns, he's forced to change his tune. And the list goes on. I mean, there's so many examples I can tell you about what would staunchly be a liberal policy that the liberals are not supporting, or vice versa, but with the conservatives. So I think our power is on social media and what we're talking about.
Discussion, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I have a question. Are you
Sure.
So you said you work in the public sector. A lot of people who work in Ottawa's a government town. A lot of people who work in the government and things like that, they don't want to say anything online because they're afraid of being fired. I'm just wondering, how are you navigating that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Leanne. So I do work for the government of Ontario, and I don't talk about anything that crosses our desks, and anything provincial. Usually I just really try to stay away from, of course, with the appropriate approvals. I just interviewed the chief coroner of Ontario, and that required approvals as well. The way I get around that is, again, I lead with curiosity. I'm not pushing an alt-right agenda. I'm not here bashing people. I'm not here doing any of that. These are questions I have inside government as well. Perhaps some people like them or they don't, but it to me, it's how do you conduct yourself regardless of what room you're in? And if it's always with integrity, then it doesn't matter anymore, right? Like, I hope, and I've had very senior ranking government officials find my podcast, listen to it, and say, I'm a subscriber. I agree with you here. I disagree with you there. I'm like, great, share it with your friends. Tell the premier, tell the prime minister. And that gives me a lot of hope and faith, because like I say to everyone, this is how I conduct myself, period. And there's no act. And if there was an act, I think people would have seen through it much earlier. I might have gotten hundreds of thousands of followers for being extreme, but I know it would always be an act. But this is who I am, and so that's what matters the most. Conduct yourself with integrity, and it doesn't matter anymore. But if you conduct yourself in a very negative, harsh way of like, I have an axe to grind and all immigrants need to be out of here, and if you have those views, I would argue it's not going to resonate with the majority because it comes from an anger-filled mentality. And interestingly enough, as much as social media says otherwise, people tend to repel very angry, frustrative-driven messages. They're much more drawn to the person or view where they understand the anger, but they come back to a more moderate solution. I don't know what it is about us, but that's how we're wired. Anger, frustration, if it comes through, you might get clicks, likes, whatever, but it doesn't resonate with an actual worldview for most people.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. And I hope it inspires people to speak up a bit more too.
Yeah.
At the end of my episodes, when I remember to ask these questions, just because they're so important to health. The opposite of isolation is what creates health. We learned that a lot, during the isolation time, the lockdown time. And I'm just wondering, like, what does community look like for you, or how would you want it to look like? And like, what are the benefits and ways that you're working on that to make it better for you?
Yeah, that's a great question, Leanne. So in-person panel discussions, in-person events is what I want to transition to. Just the other day, I saw, this is so hilarious. Just the other day, I saw on YouTube, like a clip came up on my feed because I watch all types of things, as you can imagine, of Geraldo. Geraldo, back in the day, for those that are less aware, was a talk show host back in the 80s and 90s. Well, he was one of like the very first to have very controversial guests on. He had like skinheads on and people who were very racist on his program, and he wouldn't interview them trying to understand their perspective. He would interview them and then be like, you're a piece of crap kind of thing because you're a racist, right? And so on one of his shows, he did that, and there was a fight that broke out and all hell broke loose. And I told myself, that's not what I ever want to be, because who would want to open up to you if you're coming from it through a combative lens? And so for me, leading with heart means I want to create a space, and I have it on my vision board somewhere, in Toronto, kind of like a temple of discourse, where there are events, there's panels, there's conversations, and it's like as many diverse perspectives as I can have, and they're engaged respectfully, and there's an audience that feels like they're part of that intimate conversation, and that people can leave with not some academic discussion, but like, whoa, I was really like blown away a little bit, because what I thought about the Freedom Convoy, I just heard Jenna's story. I just heard the chief of police talk about what happened to him. That to me is where the lights turn on, and people then go back and tell their MPs and MPPs to be like, hey, by the way, your policy on this needs to change. That's the real impact, I think. And that's what I'd love to transition to.
That's really beautiful. That's like
Thanks.
looking at community like really wide, and yeah, that's such a beautiful vision.
Thank you. Yeah, I hope, like, fingers crossed it could happen. But
yeah, of course they can, and I think people are hungry for it. We're hungry for having discussions that aren't so combative and disrespectful, right? And even if like the person who is combative, I'm sure that deep inside they know that they would want to be heard too, and so they can make it reciprocal, so
definitely.
And then just another question that I asked is like, so how does listening to your heart and or your intuition, how does that feel like for you, and where has it led you? I think it led you to your podcast, honestly.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely did. And so listening to my heart, I refer to my heart as my true self. And so when I'm in a conversation and I'm asking the very uncomfortable questions and I'm exploring and I'm exploring and I'm exploring, that's the self coming out because I don't need a script anymore. It's coming across like a real conversation. I'm fully engaged in what the person's saying, and that's where I'm like, when I see the wheels turning, and I'm respectfully pushing somebody on something, but they're actually now in the position where they're like, I never thought about it this way. Here's how I would navigate it. That's where I see my true self coming out because that's the power. I truly believe government is built by people who are no smarter or dumber than any one of us. And so if you understand that, then it's not, bureaucrats sitting from their ivory tower. It's just regular people who just don't know the other side to climate change, the other side to basic income. And so they push forward policy based on interest groups, not based on rigorous understanding of an issue. And that's the opening I think Open Minds has. And so that gives me goosebumps just talking about it.
It's like as if your podcast, it's called Open Mind Podcast, is like really open heart podcast.
Yes, exactly. I love that. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to share? Something that's really on your heart, or something that you just didn't finish when answering?
Yeah, the one thing I would say is get to know you more than you get to know the world. And so what I mean by that is everything that you're searching from without is within. And I truly do believe that. And so while we look to government and we look to these big institutions for change, I'm telling you all of what you want. And this is someone who, had the highest of highs and lowest of lows. It's all from within. And there is deep joy, there's deep gratitude, there's deep happiness that you cannot get from a government, from your politician, from social media, from even your partner. You can get it from within. So the journey to the world starts with the journey in the self. And so I think the journey inward is 100 times more important than the journey outward. And what you expect of your government is actually a reflection of what you expect of yourself. So hold yourself to the highest of standards and then let that translate in how you act in the world around you.
Wow, that's really beautiful.
Yeah, it was on my mind. I thought I might as well say it.
Yeah, that's super. You are very inspiring, and I hope that you continue doing what you're doing and in the ways that you want to do, because that will always change. And I'm excited to see what else you post, and I'm excited to post this episode too.
Awesome.
Yeah, so thank you so much for being here with me on my podcast.
Of course. Thanks for having me, Leanne. I'm excited for the release. Let me know when it's out.
Yeah, soon.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Super. Thank you, Chris.
Great. Thanks, Leanne.